Amelia. I want to say I'm short. Rick's tall. I want to say thanks to this meetup for inviting me to talk, and also for the ballsy decision to put Rowan and me on the same meetup, because we speak about very similar topics often. And I actually made this meetup for Rowan's meetup originally, so enjoy this combination of high-level philosophical UX talk. Also, I'm acutely aware after listening to all the talks that this talk may come across as abstract and confusing if you're not a designer. So if you have any questions that need clarifying, or you want to know what I actually do day to day, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about it. But this is who I am. I'm a UXer. I actually don't really know what to call myself anymore, but I'm building a kind of lean software as a service product, my own business. And I also work for a startup called Clover. And I'm a UX engineer there, and that is a made-up role. But it means that I do design and I do code. And so I do a bit of front end, and I'm also a writer, and I teach at General Assembly, and all-around nice guy. So as we noted before, there's already a few designers in the room. And as I said, I originally made this presentation for a design meetup. So I may be preaching to the choir to you. But the topic of this presentation isn't just pure design. It's more about like the philosophy of design and how we can apply that to different disciplines and different activities, and including, but not limited to, management, coding, and gardening. Surprise! So also this talk is for people who aren't designers, and this is really my thing. I don't want to just talk to people who are like me, and I don't think design works when it's only known by designers. I think it has to be shared by everyone else in teams, and we only design good things when we get that kind of diverse opinion coming together to solve problems in different ways. So it's really important to do this kind of talk, and I want to see more of it. But yes, it's also for designers, don't feel left out. So this talk goes through kind of how we can use design in management, engineering, even writing and gardening. And the underlying thing is that UX is awesome. That's hopefully what you will come out thinking. Design thinking is awesome. I think it is, but organizational dysfunction is not awesome. And this was not a thing I ever thought I would care about, but I do. It got me thinking as I was learning UX and practicing it, can we apply these UX principles to something like how a team is formed and how a team works together? Or could we apply them to a code base, how a code base is structured and how people work with it? Can I UX my life? Can I make my life better with these principles? And this is my mascot, because that's how I feel about all of these questions. Let's just start with what UX designers do. Does anyone want to answer that question for me quickly?
Design UXs.
Maybe. Well, they design user experiences, so yes. Anyone else?
Everything.
Everything? More specific?
Have to be more specific.
They represent the user.
Yep. Yep. What about like UI design? Yeah? Yes? No? Kind of. Maybe? Not really. What about user research and testing? That's what Rowan does. So it's that, and it's also maybe like a bit of business consulting sometimes, talking to stakeholders. Business model validation, so I'm kind of like learning about where the money's going and where the values are and trying to design around that. There's also project and product management in there a little bit because there's so many moving parts. You're working with engineers. There's feasibility and prototyping. So you don't just like make something impossible and hand it off to the engineers. You have to do a bit of work with them to make sure it can actually be done. Competitor analysis, research, that too, yep. Service design, I guess so. Like it's kind of the same bag, right? It's the same thinking. So that's a lot. But what does it actually mean to be a designer then? Let's forget like UX. What does it mean to be a designer? So for me, from all of the reading and work that I've done, it starts by being led by purpose. And this is where we get all cheesy. But I mean, like, it starts by having a goal and trying to design towards that goal. You're not just making, you know, anything. You're not just kind of creating something for its own purpose. You're doing it because there is some other reason to do it. It's It's also being human-centered. So as you said, you design for the user. We're not just designing for the human is not you, the designer. There's another human at the center. But, it's designing for people to use. We're not just designing to be used by computers or to be used by nothing. It has to be used by a person. We also fundamentally work in a way that means that we test and validate assumptions all the time. So we're constantly trying to make sure that we aren't thinking ourselves down a certain road and that we're not just working on our own perspective, but we're constantly breaking down those barriers and making sure we think in other ways. And we explode and we synthesize in that double diamond way, which is kind of this idea that like I take in lots of information and then I find ways to kind of categorize and synthesize that information and then get meaning out of that. And then I can go back and forward in this like exploding and synthesis loop. And I define, as a designer, I usually define scope and constraints. So I don't just design anything for everyone. I usually have some, set of things that I'm trying to do for a set of people that I'm trying to do. And that helps me design things within those constraints. So that looks a lot like me when I read it. And I think that doesn't mean that I'm special, but I think a lot of us do this kind of thing in a lot of different roles that we do as well, even if we're engineers or managers. So does that mean we're all designers? I'm not sure, but I kind of am interested in thinking that through. So firstly, can we solve this team dysfunction with UX? So I was in a position where I was a lead engineer and I had this team who would kind of come together in the way that teams do, in a kind of haphazard way. And it was a startup. So the dev team were getting a lot of criticism for apparently not delivering the things that people want. Who has ever been in this situation? Everyone. So I started to think about this process and this problem like a designer. So the first thing I did was I talked to the team. So any good UX process starts with talking and as Ron said, listening. So we started talking to people and asking these open questions and learning about their experience. So very classic UX research question is, tell me about the last time you did blah, blah, blah. So there's a difference. Ron didn't go into this absolute basic, but the difference between like an open and closed question is that a closed question is like a yes or no answer, which just like affirms what you already know. Whereas an open question means that someone goes on a rambling story and you get to understand things that you didn't even know you could ask. So this allows people to recount experiences. So we sort of started interviewing our own team and people outside of our team this way. Luckily, there are lots of tools already out there for doing this kind of research with people in your team. 15.5 is a tool, it's like a feedback tool. There's a few other ones out there. Allows you to kind of constantly be doing this qualitative research with your team where they're constantly giving you kind of a little story about their day or how they're feeling, and you get to incorporate that into how you manage them. Also, like Agile has a meeting called a retro, you guys have probably experienced it, where essentially there's kind of the day-to-day tickets and delivery stuff, and then the retro is the meeting about how you feel about what's happened. And that allows people to put their thoughts up, categorize them, and then talk through them in a kind of safe space. So all of these kind of things were ways that we were getting this information from our team in a really kind of designy way. And this is what we found. Feels like nobody understands the work we're doing is important. I'm not sure what the engineering team are doing that's more important than what I'm asking for. I don't really understand code stuff. I can't really tell how busy the team is because they're so quiet. I don't know how to explain the value of the work I do to non-technical people. So we had kind of problems on both sides. We had the people outside of the team had no idea what the team was doing, and people inside the team felt kind of intimidated and not sure how to communicate. So next step is that synthesis. So that's the going out and getting the information. The synthesis is bringing it together. So we facilitated rather than dictating the process. And that means that, you come in and you feel humble rather than feeling like you know exactly what to do. So it's really easy with design to be like, I know exactly how to solve this, and now I'm just going to bulldoze my way through. So instead of that, you kind of come in a way where you try to facilitate design ideas from other people as well as your own. And this kind of thinking has been really popular recently, and really this book, Google Ventures Design Sprints. Has anyone done a Google Design Sprint? It's like an intense 5-day intellectual workout of trying to solve problems with your whole team. But it really is based on facilitating design rather than forcing it through. And it means that we kind of get this, design ideas from other people, not just your own. So you think of different ways to solve the problems. So from that, you're able to design the problems and the scope so you know how to solve them. So one really cool way that a lot of organizations have been tackling this is thinking about OKRs. Does anyone work in an organization that uses OKRs? So it's about kind of taking problems within the organization and separating them to objectives and key results. So the objective sits at the top and each objective underneath it has key results. So the objective is qualitative and the key results are quantitative. So for example, if I just think about key results, I can easily miss out on the bigger goal behind it. So if say do you guys know what an NPS is? NPS score? So I just want to get my NPS score up, but I don't really think about why I want to get it up. I could easily just go and bribe everyone, right? That's the only result is get the NPS score up. So I'm just going to give everyone bottles of wine until they give me a higher rating. That hasn't actually improved the product at all, but the NPS score has gone up. So instead of just say we want a higher NPS score, we have an objective overall, which is our customers freaking love our product. And then underneath that, the key result or the indicator for that thing being true is that the NPS score has gone up. So make sure that you focus on the thing that's meaningful. So in this case, less criticism of the dev team, but the indicators were people no longer coming to our area yelling or crying, startup life, and engineers report more satisfaction and happiness in their reviews. And we were able to achieve those. So how do we know? We ran some experiments, and a really important design idea is just go out and try stuff. So you've got an idea, you've designed a solution, try it. So we follow this technique, this build, measure, learn loop, which means that we build a solution, we put it into practice and we measure it, we get learnings from that, and then we build something else and we continually iterate through that loop. So my solution was try writing and sending out detailed release notes with happy GIFs for a month. The GIFs really worked. I put them all the way at the end of the email, so people had to read through all of the release notes to get to the GIF. And surprisingly, people were like, wow, I really want to open those emails, not just for the GIFs. So they ended up understanding more about what the dev team were delivering because I'd kind of bribed them, but they also started to read it, which they'd never done before. So the other thing we did was we changed the name of the team to the product team instead of just the dev team because we wanted to show that what we did in the team was more than just development. We were actually building a product. And that had a huge effect. Weirdly, it just changed the way that people perceive the team. So we were able to kind of measure the success of these things, and we saw that the problem kind of started to go away. So that was awesome. So another thing that we tried to design was a better code base. And this is kind of like a thing for me now. And it makes me a little bit annoying to work with because I'm always trying to make the perfect code base. But again, like it starts with the same process, talking to the users. So in this case, the users are the people using the code base, so the developers. So the things that we heard were, I don't know what this code from a long time ago does. I can't find things in the folder structure, so I just searched the entire project for keywords. There's a lot of duplication, so any task takes a long time. There's so many different code styles going on, it's hard to know what is the way to do anything. And the SAS files are really long, so when there's an error, I have to comb through the whole file to find one misplaced semicolon. Who's lived that life? So lots of feedback. How do we synthesize and refine it? We started to refine it through the lens of usability heuristics, which is a design principle that I think perfectly applies to how a code base could work. So this is from the Nielsen Norman website. This isn't the be-all and end-all of usability and is, variously, quoted as being not perfect, and that's fine, but it's something to work with. So these heuristics are used to evaluate different sites, usability, like in terms of design, but I don't see why this can't be applied to a messy code base. Like the visibility of system status. How do you know that your tests are passing? Match between system and real world. Are these functions named in a way that actually makes sense, or are they like random weird names that are in jokes from 3 years ago? Don't even start. User control and freedom. How easy is it to change things, or do you have to like read through documentation in 12 different places? Consistency and standards. Is it the same everywhere, or is it like a mishmash of like 12 different developers who had different strong opinions about semicolon usage? Error prevention. When you make an error, does it actually just continue to evaluate and give you no feedback, or is there like a nice parser that's giving you feedback about whether it's working? Recognition rather than recall. So that's an idea of like, can you like understand it rather than trying to comb back through your memory? So again, like the naming of things is really useful there, making sure that things are named in a way that you could quickly understand what they are. Flexibility and efficiency of use. So an example could be, is it easy to spin up a new page? Is it easy to spin up a new module? Or do you have to go through some terrible long process that means like 20 files and folders have to be created manually? Aesthetic and minimalist design. Is it easy to read, or is it just like full of weird, crazy comments and like really long files? Can users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors? So we've kind of been through that in the other heuristics. And help in documentation, like, is it commented? Do these weird functions actually, that are kind of like polyfills, are they noted? Can you tell what's on purpose and what's just a hack? That kind of thing. Again, design heuristics that are easily applied to a code base. So when we started to apply these heuristics, we started to see that the difference between something being easy and something being simple became apparent. This is from Rich Hickey's talk. It's an amazing talk. And he talks about easy, which is kind of like near, close, easy to reach, close to you, versus simple, which is like kind of not woven together. So simple from simplex is the opposite of complex. And complex is like complected. So it's like something that's knitted together. Whereas something that's simple is like a single strand rather than a woven tapestry. So a simple thing is like a building block, whereas an easy thing is just easy, it's just close. Like it's easy for me to whip something up in Photoshop, but it's probably more simple for me to create like a modular design that can be extended on later. And the same thing with a code base. It's easy to just like write it all in and just like do whatever feels good last time you did it that way. But it's simpler to think about it and design it and create it in a way that's extendable for the future that other people can work with. Simple things take longer at the start, but they become faster over time. Whereas easy things are very fast at the start, but get very slow over time. So you've probably experienced this to some extent. So how do we fix it? Like, what can you actually do here? These are all the problems. What we ended up doing is thinking about using a design pattern for how we organize our code. So atomic design is this idea that you can break down any kind of web design into different levels, starting from a page through to a template, an organism, a molecule, and then an atom at the very smallest bit. And, when you're creating a design system, you might design it in this way. But that kind of design thinking bit often doesn't get translated to when it gets put into code. So we started to get the engineers and designers collaborating and using this system as a way to organize folders and files, as well as just the actual original design intent. And so we ended up with kind of lots of small folders of little components rather than long files of like combined mashup CSS. And that made it insanely easy to use. It was now like so simple and easy to know exactly where to do the next thing if you wanted to create a new component. And it meant that even though it took a long time to refactor, as soon as that refactor was done, it was just like wildfire. It was just like so fast. It was awesome. So we measured it. Nothing is done unless you measure it. So the way we measured it was with our cycle time to see if like the tickets were speeding up from kind of design inception through to delivery. And we were able to really see that like that cycle time was drastically decreased, and we could measure at each stage of our process from the ticket inception to delivery through, design, development, testing, automated testing, that we were seeing the blockages kind of decreasing. It was going much smoother through that process. So awesome, design worked. Another thing that I've done like as a writer is I've started to incorporate design into my writing process. So how can we, for example, write a blog post to encourage more users to sign up to a product? So again, start with interviews, like start talking to some users, understand a bit more about them. Even if you're hired as a third party, as an agency to come in and do this, always starting with that kind of user-centered approach is going to help you. So it means that, even if you can't find users, at least, read support chat logs or talk to support staff, because they're obviously going to have a really good insight to how the users work. And then you can even make your own persona if you want to try and summarize what you've learned about the users. Because like writing, like design, like anything, it's all about that audience. It's about the users. So you want to really understand what makes them work and not just kind of write it for someone like you, because you might not be the right user. Or if you want, you can kind of use this structure, which is from the jobs to be done philosophy, which is kind of talking, rather not focusing on demographics, but more when something, I want to something, so I can something. So really thinking about what their motivation is and then writing to that motivation. Or empathy mapping, where you kind of try to focus in and go step into someone else's shoes and think about what it would be like to be them. The other thing that's really, really useful for writing and most creative endeavors is to just generate heaps and heaps of ideas and then cut them down and refine them. So it kind of makes you be less precious and less stuck to your first idea. This is a UX technique called Crazy Eights, where you fold a piece of paper into eight squares and then in a very short period of time just sketch something in each square. And then even though like most of what you've done is crap, at least one thing you've done is going to be probably different to what you were initially thinking, just because you've kind of forced yourself through that pressure funnel. And this can be really useful when you're trying to solve any kind of problem. But I find it really useful with writing to almost kind of sketch, like copy sketch my words a little bit. So think about different ways to say something, 8 different ways, and then that will allow me to kind of find maybe a different way that was less boring than the first way I thought of. And then, of course, testing it. So test it with some users or potential users. Don't just like get it tested with your manager. Put in front of someone else and see what they think of it, someone that's outside of the bubble of your organization, and get them to give you feedback rather than just kind of being insular to your own way of thinking. Because it might work for you, but it might not work for someone else, even if they're doing pretty much the same thing. So obviously, then the next step is to, I've lost Rowan, he's done. Then the last thing that you do is you want to adjust and iterate. So you make sure that rather than being precious to that first draft, you're able to edit it and continually edit it until it works. So easy. What about just wanting to live a better life? There's a whole school of thought out there now trying to think about how we can use these design principles and apply it to our lives. This is a really amazing book. It's from the Stanford D School, and they run a course there, which is basically called Designing Your Life, which was originally made for grads who didn't know how to get jobs. And it kind of expanded to people who just didn't know what to do with themselves or how to live their lives or just wanted some idea of how to find meaning. And they believe that everyone has the capacity to be creative and do design. And I do as well. And I think that these techniques are so simple and so basic and so instinctive for us that it makes sense to start thinking this way if you can, because it can kind of allow you to what they call reframe and think about things in a different way. And that can only be positive. Or this guy. Why can't I? Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss has an amazing podcast, but he's written a few books like The 4-Hour Work Week, and his mission is to just improve himself in every way possible, and he really uses design principles to do that. For example, he taught himself how to play the drums in like a very short 48 hours, something ridiculous. And his whole idea is adding those constraints and forcing himself into these situations where he has to design a solution. And he kind of constantly experiments on himself. I wasn't sending a message. and he makes it work. And it's fascinating to see how he uses these techniques. Or this book I can highly recommend called How to Find Fulfilling Work. It kind of uses design ideas of how you could find a different job that makes you happier, including imaginary lives, which is like an exercise for imagining what kind of person you could be, if you weren't in your current situation, or a personal job ad where you write a job ad for yourself for your specific set of skills. Or radical sabbaticals where you take kind of time off your job and go do a different job that's completely crazily different from what you do, and you learn from that and you learn about yourself. It's a really cool book. So the last bit of my talk is about my own problem that I designed for, which was that I wanted to grow edible plants, but the conditions weren't very good. I was living in the city, and this is a selection of my failures, including very tiny herbs that never grew past that stage, beans that were eaten by caterpillars, and a very sad tomato plant. And these tiny carrots. So I was plagued by pests and poor sunlight conditions, but I traveled and I went out and I, expanded my thinking, and I thought about different ways that I could do it. And this is a blackberry bush growing in the bed of a creek in Adelaide. And boy, do they grow. Blackberries are insanely hard to stop growing. They are out of control and very, very spiky, but very delicious. And we went and picked some blackberries and we had a look at how they were growing. And I kind of got an idea that what if we could just grow our plants directly in water? This is not weed. But when we bought it, we definitely went through a very strange situation at a hydroponic store where they definitely thought we were growing weed, which we were not. This is kale and basil and mint in a small pool of water in a reflective tent on my table. This was our first prototype of how we could grow plants in water inside with artificial sunlight. This setup was a bit tricky. We had to put nutrients into the water. So we had to kind of have this meth lab set up going on with test tubes and weird powders and it was a lot. But it grew, it grew and grew to the point that it was kind of too big for the little tent. So it did work, but we didn't really know what to do with it at this stage. That's not scalable either, right? It's just this one little tent. Also, we were going to move to a smaller apartment, not sure what to do there. So we upgraded. This is in our garage. This is a tray, and it's got the same seedlings from this picture, which looked much smaller in this setup, and 2 big tubs of water and a pump that was circulating the water through the system. And then we iterated. So we found that, we wanted to upgrade the water quality. So we added granite, which would cultivate bacteria. Lots and lots of research on some very strange forums. And, and then we iterated again. We found that this was really difficult to manage because the roots were getting tied together and we wanted to start actually eating it. Our needs changed. So we bought these pink containers from Daiso and found these strange permeated clay balls and then put all of the plants into the clay balls, and then they kind of were supported so we could actually scale it. We could put more plants in. And then we added some fish. That's my catfish. And catfish cleaned the tank for you as well, which is awesome. But we added a lot of fish, but then we poisoned the fish, and that's the ammonia levels in the tank, which definitely were not supposed to be that color. But the fish didn't die. And everything flourished. And in fact, we were able to start thinking about what would happen next, because the only problem was that this setup would not fit into our new apartment. So we bought a pond, which is what this is. You can't really see it, but it's basically a bathtub. And we moved it to the balcony of our new apartment, and we were able to get rid of the light and we put it in the sunlight. And now we have this harvest, every month. We harvest this much basil and we make pesto. It's very unexpected from where we originally started, but I'm definitely making edible food, and I live in a tiny 40 square meter apartment in Richmond. So it worked. We managed to kind of iterate through this design to the level where now we can, I can sell you one of these jars for $10 if you want. Design thinking, what does it mean? It means we validate early. We start with simple tests and prototypes, and we see whether they work and whether we should continue. We don't just go with the highest paid person in the room, unless they're an actual hippo, in which case definitely go with the hippo. We challenge assumptions and the status quo. We think differently. We reframe. We help people solve their own problems by facilitating design thinking. We know that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So sometimes you have to slow down to speed up later. And we bring everything back to that bigger goal of what you're originally trying to achieve. We actively listen and we approach problems humbly. So what's stopping you from doing any of those things? I don't know. That's me. Thank you.